December 7, 1941, was a day that would change the lives of thousands of Japanese Americans forever. The attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Imperial Navy sent shockwaves across the United States, not just on the battlefield but deep within its own shores. Fear, suspicion, and anger spread as rapidly as the news itself. Across the West Coast, newspapers printed bold headlines declaring "Enemy among us," and "Japanese threat looms." Families who had lived peacefully for generations suddenly found themselves under the watchful eyes of neighbors, authorities, and even casual passers-by. The nation was at war, and with war came suspicion that transformed an entire community into potential enemies in the eyes of the state. For Japanese Americans, the Pearl Harbor attack was both a national shock and a personal catastrophe. Many were second or third generation citizens Nisei and Sansei whose families had contributed to American society for decades. They ran farms, owned businesses, served in schools, and volunteered in civic organizations. Yet overnight, loyalty to the United States became a question, not an assumption. Soldiers, merchants, and students who had previously lived ordinary lives were now being eyed with distrust. Stores posted "No Japs Allowed" signs, landlords refused to renew leases, and neighbors whispered anxiously about possible sabotage. Fear morphed into policy as federal authorities deliberated on measures to address what they framed as a national security threat. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the military to designate military areas from which anyone could be excluded. In practice, this meant Japanese American citizens and immigrants alike on the West Coast were now considered subject to forced removal. The order did not explicitly mention Japanese Americans, yet its effect was immediate and devastating. Families were given little time, sometimes just a week, to pack their lives into what they could carry. Homes were abandoned, farms left fallow, and businesses shuttered. Life savings evaporated as sales of property were forced under duress, often at pennies on the dollar. The government provided minimal compensation, but no amount could replace the loss of home, security, and dignity. The logistics of removal were chaotic but systematic. The War Relocation Authority, a newly created government agency, coordinated transportation and temporary housing. Families were instructed to report to assembly centers, often located at fairgrounds, racetracks, and armories, where they would wait for transfer to permanent internment camps. Buses, trains, and trucks carried thousands of internees inland, leaving familiar neighborhoods behind. For many children, the journey was bewildering. The landscapes changed from bustling cities to empty deserts, the air grew drier, and the horizon stretched endlessly, signaling the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Parents struggled to maintain calm, packing essentials while reassuring frightened children, aware that they were embarking on a journey from which the world as they knew it would never return unchanged. In these temporary assembly centers, life was a stark contrast to the homes left behind. Barracks and converted stables became living quarters for entire families. Privacy was non-existent. Multiple families shared rooms, latrines, and communal kitchens. The psychological impact was immediate. Children had to adapt to regimented schedules, unfamiliar peers, and the constant presence of guards. Adults struggled with feelings of shame, helplessness, and betrayal. Yet within these provisional spaces, communities attempted to preserve a sense of normalcy. Schools were improvised, religious services held in makeshift chapels, and cultural activities organized to distract from the harsh reality. Even amid barbed wire and armed watchtowers, life found a way to persist. The journey from assembly centers to permanent internment camps further intensified the ordeal. Camps were constructed in remote, inhospitable areas, deserts, swamplands, and arid plains chosen for their isolation. Manzanar in California, Poston in Arizona, Tule Lake in Northern California, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, and Gila River in Arizona became infamous symbols of displacement. Families were transported under armed guard, often traveling long distances by train, enduring crowded cars, and facing uncertainty at every turn. Upon arrival, they were met with barracks, mess halls, and barbed wire fences that enclosed the landscape like a prison. The camps were functional but barren, designed for containment rather than comfort, with minimal heating, poor sanitation, and inadequate medical facilities. Yet, the first days and weeks in the camps also revealed resilience. Parents organized informal schools for children, taught cultural lessons, and maintained traditions despite their confinement. Community leaders coordinated food distribution, sanitation, and work assignments, ensuring that even in hardship, structure and routine persisted. Families found solace in small acts, planting gardens in the dusty soil, teaching children Japanese songs, or gathering for shared meals. Internees began to create a semblance of society within the barbed wire, asserting their dignity and humanity in the face of systemic injustice. Throughout the early months of internment, the tension between survival and resistance simmered. Some internees quietly protested the injustice, documenting their experiences, petitioning authorities, or engaging in small acts of defiance. Others sought to prove their loyalty through military service, even as their families remained confined. The War Relocation Authority attempted to control all aspects of life, yet they could not extinguish the spirit of those held within the camps. Despite barbed wire, armed guards, and harsh landscapes, internees carved out community, culture, and purpose. Each day was a testament to endurance, a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to reduce them to mere numbers and statistics. By the end of 1942, the initial shock of displacement had evolved into grim routine. The reality of internment became a permanent fixture of life for thousands, yet the human spirit proved remarkably adaptable. Children went to school, adults worked in fields or constructed infrastructure, and communities organized cultural, religious, and social activities. Hope persisted, not the hope of immediate release, but the hope that the injustice might one day end, that families could return to their homes, and that life could be rebuilt. Even in confinement, identity endured, culture survived, and the seeds of resilience took root in the harsh soil of internment. The story of Japanese internment camps was not just a story of incarceration, it was a story of survival, endurance, and the fragility of civil liberties in times of fear. As families adapted to the stark realities of barbed wire, dust, and ration lines, they carried forward the memory of normal life, the lessons of hardship, and the determination to reclaim their dignity. The shadow of war had fallen across their lives, but in the midst of confinement, a sense of community and resilience illuminated even the darkest corners of the camps. Life inside the camps. When Japanese Americans arrived at the internment camps, the initial shock of displacement gave way to the daily grind of survival. The barracks were cold in winter, blistering in summer, and unbearably dusty in the arid winds that swept through desert locations like Manzanar and Poston. Families who had once lived in bustling cities or fertile farmland were now confined to a few wooden planks and a single stove. Walls were thin, floors creaked underfoot, and privacy was a luxury few could claim. Yet, within these Spartan conditions, internees began to reassemble fragments of life, creating a semblance of normalcy amid restriction and surveillance. Children were among the most vulnerable to the upheaval, yet they displayed remarkable adaptability. Makeshift classrooms sprang up in repurposed mess halls, community centers, and even tents. Teachers, often internees themselves, worked tirelessly to provide a structured education. Lessons included basic reading, mathematics, and history, but they also carried subtle messages of resilience and identity. While the curriculum emphasized assimilation into American culture, it also allowed for the preservation of Japanese language and heritage. Children played baseball in dusty fields, organized small theater performances, and participated in art projects, forging bonds that would help them navigate the emotional toll of confinement. Adults faced a different kind of struggle. Many had been farmers, merchants, and professionals. Now they were compelled to take on manual labor, administrative tasks, or service roles within the camp. Jobs included maintaining barracks, cooking in communal kitchens, farming internal plots, and operating camp facilities. Despite the labor being necessary for survival, it came with a psychological burden. Men who had once managed businesses or owned land now toiled in positions that seemed beneath their previous status. Women, often the backbone of family organization, balanced cooking, cleaning, and child care with community responsibilities, sustaining not only their households but the social cohesion of entire barracks. The camps were governed with military-like precision. Barbed wire fences, guard towers, and armed personnel ensured strict control, while curfews and regulations dictated daily routines. Internees were assigned identification numbers, and personal movements were monitored. The ever-present surveillance created a sense of claustrophobia, a constant reminder that freedom had been suspended. Despite this, internees organized councils and committees to manage internal affairs. These bodies oversaw food distribution, sanitation, education, and recreational programs, giving residents a measure of autonomy and responsibility. In effect, the camps became self-sustaining microcosms of society, reflecting both the resilience and ingenuity of those confined within them. Food was a central concern. Initial rations were meager, repetitive, and often culturally unfamiliar. Rice, beans, powdered milk, and canned vegetables replaced fresh produce and traditional meals. Yet internees adapted creatively. Women experimented with available ingredients to recreate familiar flavors, while families organized communal meals that provided not just sustenance but emotional comfort. Agricultural projects within camps allowed some semblance of cultivation, producing vegetables and fruit for camp consumption. Farming became more than food production. It was an assertion of agency, a way to reclaim a sense of purpose and normalcy in an otherwise controlled environment. Healthcare was another pressing challenge. Clinics were often understaffed, and medical supplies were limited. Common illnesses spread quickly in the crowded barracks, while the psychological toll of confinement manifested in anxiety, depression, and feelings of helplessness. Interns relied heavily on community support, sharing knowledge of herbal remedies, child care strategies, and emotional counseling. Teachers, religious leaders, and camp volunteers became critical sources of guidance and stability, reinforcing the notion that survival depended not only on physical well-being but also on communal solidarity. Cultural life, despite restrictions, flourished as internees sought to maintain identity and dignity. Festivals, theater productions, and musical performances provided relief from monotony and oppression. Religious practices continued in makeshift chapels and outdoor spaces, whether Buddhist, Shinto, or Christian. Poetry and storytelling allowed individuals to process trauma and document experiences, creating an internal record of resilience that would later inform historical memory. These activities were acts of resistance in their own right, assertions of humanity and cultural continuity in the face of systemic erasure. The dynamics within camps were complex. Tensions sometimes arose between long-term residents and new arrivals, or between different generations navigating differing expectations. Older internees often clung to traditional practices, while younger Nisei adapted more readily to camp life and American cultural norms. Yet shared adversity created bonds that transcended differences. Mutual aid networks developed, neighbors looked out for one another, and children formed lifelong friendships. Even in a controlled and often dehumanizing environment, the social fabric of the community remained remarkably strong. Military service added another layer of complexity. While their families remained confined, some Nisei volunteered or were drafted into the U.S. Army. Units like the 442nd Regimental Combat Team became emblematic of loyalty and bravery, serving with distinction in Europe. For many internees, military service was a paradoxical act, proving allegiance to a nation that had stripped them of liberty, while also striving to protect the ideals of freedom and justice. Letters from the front brought hope and pride to families in camps, even as they highlighted the stark contrast between the sacrifices of soldiers and the captivity of their loved ones. The psychological impact of camp life extended far beyond physical hardship. Internees grappled with feelings of shame, guilt, and anger. Being labeled enemy by their own government challenged their sense of identity and belonging. Yet, within this adversity, resilience emerged. People found strength in routines, community, cultural continuity, and small victories: growing a tomato plant in dusty soil, teaching a child to read, or organizing a successful festival. These acts reaffirmed dignity, instilled hope, and fostered a sense of purpose that transcended physical confinement. By the end of the war, internees had spent years enduring harsh conditions, systemic discrimination, and psychological strain. Yet they had also demonstrated remarkable adaptability, creativity, and cohesion. Schools, farms, clinics, and community organizations had transformed barren plots and wooden barracks into functioning societies, a testament to human resilience under oppression. Camp life, with all its hardships, left a lasting imprint on those who survived, shaping identity, family dynamics, and cultural memory for generations. The story of life inside the camps is not merely one of confinement, but of endurance and ingenuity. It reveals the ways in which a community, stripped of freedom and dignity, found ways to survive, adapt, and assert humanity. Amid barbed wire, dusty roads, and guarded perimeters, internees built structures of learning, culture, and support that transcended physical captivity, leaving a legacy of resilience and courage that would echo far beyond the fences of the camps. Resistance, legal battles, and loyalty. Life in the internment camps was suffocating, but not everyone accepted confinement silently. From the earliest days of relocation, internees navigated a tension between survival and resistance. They lived in a paradoxical reality, forced behind barbed wire yet constantly reminded of their American citizenship, their rights suspended at the discretion of the government. This dissonance sparked a variety of responses: quiet defiance, legal challenges, and expressions of loyalty designed to prove that their patriotism could not be questioned. The story of resistance within the camps illuminates the complex interplay between oppression, identity, and justice. Resistance often began with small, personal acts. Families discreetly preserved cultural artifacts, continued speaking Japanese at home, and maintained religious rituals despite official restrictions. In classrooms, children recited traditional poems and learned ancestral history, subtle assertions of identity that defied the government's implicit message that their heritage was suspect. Community leaders organized debates, newsletters, and informal assemblies to keep residents informed and engaged, fostering a sense of agency that stood in stark contrast to the rigid, militarized control surrounding them. Even small gestures: a shared meal prepared in traditional fashion, a family photograph hidden from authorities, became symbols of resilience. Legal battles became a critical arena for resistance, though pursuing justice was fraught with difficulty. The U.S. Supreme Court became an unlikely stage where individual internees challenged the legality of confinement. Korematsu v. United States, 1944, became the most infamous case. Fred Korematsu had defied the exclusion order and was arrested for refusing to leave his home. His lawyers argued that internment violated the Constitution, emphasizing that it targeted citizens based on race rather than proven disloyalty. Yet the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the exclusion orders, citing military necessity. This decision, while devastating, highlighted the perilous balance between civil liberties and wartime fears, and it ignited discussions that would resonate for decades. Other legal efforts sought to address different facets of injustice. Cases like Hirabayashi v. United States and ex parte Endo tested curfews and the detention of loyal citizens. Gordon Hirabayashi had defied the curfew imposed specifically on Japanese Americans, and while his conviction was initially upheld, Endo's case ultimately led the court to recognize that the government could not detain citizens who were demonstrably loyal. These cases underscored the nuanced strategies internees employed to assert rights within a system designed to suppress them. Legal resistance was slow, complicated, and emotionally taxing, yet it demonstrated that the internees were not passive victims, they were active participants in the struggle to reclaim justice. Loyalty questionnaires added another layer of tension. In 1943, the War Relocation Authority issued forms asking internees to declare willingness to serve in the U.S. military and renounce allegiance to the Japanese emperor. For many, the questions were fraught with moral and emotional dilemmas. Answering affirmatively might affirm loyalty to a country that had stripped them of freedom, answering negatively risked accusations of disloyalty or imprisonment in maximum security camps like Tule Lake. Young Nisei, eager to demonstrate patriotism, often volunteered for military service despite their family's internment. Others resisted compliance, asserting their rights and questioning the fairness of such coercive measures. The loyalty question became a crucible, revealing divisions, courage, and strategic resistance within the community. Military service itself was a paradoxical form of resistance. The formation of the 442 ND Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans, provided internees an opportunity to fight for a country that had imprisoned their families. These soldiers distinguished themselves in Europe, earning unprecedented recognition for bravery, including the Congressional Medal of Honor. Their actions countered prevailing stereotypes, undermined assumptions of disloyalty, and forged a powerful narrative of patriotism intertwined with protest. Letters sent home from soldiers inspired families in the camps, offering hope and a sense of connection to the wider war effort, even as they endured daily hardship behind fences. Social and cultural resistance also persisted in creative forms. Newspapers written by internees circulated within camps, reporting local news, commentary on policies, and cultural pieces. Literary clubs, poetry contests, and theater productions provided psychological relief and preserved communal identity. Art and crafts, often made from limited materials, became expressions of resilience, documenting the struggles and aspirations of internees. These acts of cultural endurance reinforced a sense of self-worth, allowed communities to assert agency, and became lasting records of the internees' inner lives during confinement. Yet, resistance came with consequences. Camp authorities monitored activities closely, and individuals who challenged regulations faced discipline, relocation to stricter camps, or social ostracism. The internees' struggle was not merely against external oppression but also against fear within their own community. Suspicion, peer pressure, and generational conflicts complicated acts of defiance. Those who resisted had to navigate both authority and social dynamics carefully, balancing moral imperatives with survival and communal harmony. The broader American society began to confront these issues slowly. Journalists, civil rights advocates, and sympathetic politicians questioned the legality and morality of internment. These critiques, combined with legal challenges and the valor of Nisei soldiers, gradually shifted public opinion. By the end of the war, the seeds of redress had been sown, even if immediate justice remained elusive. The internees' insistence on dignity, rights, and loyalty in the face of systemic oppression laid the groundwork for future acknowledgement, reparations, and recognition of civil liberties. Resistance and loyalty during internment highlight a complex duality. Internees were forced into an environment designed to strip autonomy and identity, yet they responded with courage, creativity, and strategic engagement. Legal challenges demonstrated the capacity to use the system itself as a tool of protest. Military service showcased patriotism as a form of defiance. Cultural preservation affirmed identity under duress. These intertwined responses formed a multifaceted resistance that defied simplistic narratives of victimhood, revealing a community actively shaping its destiny even in confinement. As the war neared its end, internees prepared for release, carrying the lessons of resistance and loyalty into an uncertain future. Families faced the daunting task of rebuilding lives in cities from which they had been forcibly removed. The experiences within the camp's loss, hardship, courage, and defiance left indelible marks on individuals and families. Yet the legacy of resistance endured, informing post-war activism, civil rights movements, and ongoing struggles for justice. The internees' courage, strategic engagement, and cultural endurance became a blueprint for asserting rights in the face of systemic oppression, a story that continues to resonate in American history. The narrative of resistance within Japanese internment camps is not simply one of opposition, it is a story of survival, identity, and assertion of dignity under extreme conditions. Legal battles, military service, cultural preservation, and subtle acts of defiance demonstrate the multifaceted ways in which internees navigated the complex terrain of confinement, fear, and injustice. This chapter of history underscores the resilience of human spirit and the persistent quest for justice, offering enduring lessons on the importance of civil liberties, civic engagement, and moral courage. Release, aftermath, and legacy. As 1945 arrived and the Second World War drew to a close, the barbed wires and guard towers that had defined life for Japanese Americans began to lose their grip, but the scars of internment were far from erased. The government officially began closing the camps, issuing instructions for internees to return to their homes, often in communities that had moved on without them. The process of release was chaotic and uneven. Many families returned to empty neighborhoods, vandalized homes, or properties sold at steep losses. The psychological weight of displacement was compounded by the challenge of rebuilding lives from scratch, a daunting task after years of enforced confinement. The journey back to normal life was fraught with obstacles. Employment opportunities were scarce, especially for those who had lost businesses, farmland, or professional licenses during internment. Discrimination persisted. Some landlords refused to rent to returning Japanese Americans, while schools and communities were often unwelcoming. Social reintegration was complicated by the lingering stigma of suspicion. Neighbors who had once feared internees' loyalty continued to treat them as outsiders. Yet, amid these challenges, families displayed remarkable resilience, re-establishing homes, reconnecting with community, and reclaiming their place in American society. Economic recovery was a slow process. Many internees faced financial ruin, having lost savings and property during forced evacuation. Families pooled resources, relied on community networks, and took jobs wherever available, often far below their previous social and economic status. Some moved to urban centers in search of employment, while others rebuilt farms from the ground up. Over time, Japanese Americans gradually regained economic stability, though the shadow of wartime dispossession lingered for decades. The effort to recover financially mirrored the larger struggle to restore dignity and agency, a process requiring patience, determination, and mutual support. Psychologically, internees carried complex legacies of trauma, resilience, and identity. For children who had grown up in camps, adolescence was marked by the challenge of reconciling two worlds: the cultural heritage preserved behind fences and the broader American society that had once rejected them. Adults bore the weight of lost years, the shame of displacement, and the effort to rebuild not only homes but self-esteem. Support networks within Japanese American communities became vital, offering social, emotional, and practical guidance. Churches, cultural organizations, and family networks played central roles in helping individuals navigate post-internment life. The federal government's response to the injustices of internment evolved slowly. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed legislation providing limited financial assistance to returning Japanese Americans, though it fell far short of reparations for the years of confinement and economic loss. The decades following the war saw persistent advocacy by Japanese American groups, civil rights organizations, and sympathetic politicians. Their efforts culminated in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which formally apologized for the internment, acknowledged that it was the result of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership, and provided monetary reparations to surviving internees. This acknowledgement, though delayed, represented a critical step in validating the experiences and suffering of those who had endured the camps. Education and memory became essential tools in ensuring the legacy of internment was not forgotten. Survivors shared stories, wrote memoirs, and participated in oral history projects, preserving first-hand accounts for future generations. Schools incorporated lessons about internment, using it as a lens to teach civil rights, constitutional protections, and the dangers of prejudice in times of national crisis. Museums and memorials, including the Manzanar National Historic Site, commemorate the resilience of internees, offering a space for reflection, learning, and remembrance. The legacy of internment extends beyond Japanese Americans, serving as a cautionary tale about the fragility of civil liberties during periods of fear and uncertainty. Cultural identity, shaped by both confinement and resistance, persisted and evolved in post-war communities. Festivals, arts, cuisine, and traditions were reintegrated into broader American society, often blending Japanese heritage with new experiences shaped by internment. Families emphasized education, civic engagement, and public service, determined that future generations would thrive and contribute to society while never forgetting the past. The Nisei and Sansei generations became pillars of their communities, embodying lessons of resilience, responsibility, and the ongoing fight for justice. Intergenerational impact was profound. Children who had been confined carried the stories and lessons of survival into adulthood. Their experiences fostered advocacy, social consciousness, and engagement in civil rights movements beyond their own communities. The collective memory of internment shaped attitudes toward justice, equality, and government accountability, influencing not only Japanese American identity but also broader American discussions about civil liberties, minority rights, and the responsibilities of a democratic society. While internment remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, it is also a testament to human endurance. The camps stripped individuals of freedom, dignity, and property, yet they could not extinguish spirit, culture, or hope. Families rebuilt, communities persevered, and survivors transformed trauma into advocacy, education, and cultural preservation. The story of Japanese American internment is not solely one of victimhood, it is a narrative of courage, resilience, and moral tenacity, demonstrating that even in the face of systemic oppression, human beings find ways to assert dignity and shape the future. Today, remembrance of internment serves multiple purposes, honoring those who suffered, educating future generations, and acting as a societal check against prejudice and fear-driven policies. Memorials, literature, films, and public discourse keep the lessons alive, emphasizing vigilance, empathy, and the protection of civil rights. The experiences of Japanese Americans during World War II remind the nation that liberty and justice require constant defense, and that vigilance against discrimination is a moral and civic responsibility shared by all. In the final analysis, the internment of Japanese Americans underscores the consequences of unchecked fear and prejudice in a democratic society. Yet it also illuminates the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for communities to support one another, and the enduring pursuit of justice against formidable odds. From the barbed wire of Manzanar and Tule Lake to the halls of the Supreme Court and beyond, the story of internment is a powerful narrative of loss, resistance, and eventual acknowledgement, a story whose lessons remain vital for generations to come.